All right, so in this lesson, we're going to go over food and biodiversity. In the first video, we'll just focus on the biodiversity side. Okay, so first of all, what is biodiversity? So feel free to press pause and think about what that term might mean. It's a combination of two words, and then what it is just an abbreviation for biological diversity. And so it's pretty self-explanatory, I think. It's you can think of it as the variety of life. I think that's kind of the easiest way to think about it. So, but there's a couple of different ways you can look at variety. I'll go over here in a minute. One thing that's really interesting about biodiversity is very much scalable. In other words, it exists on different scales. It exists on just basically every scale. So you can think of the biodiversity of Earth. So think of the variety of life on the Earth. So you can look at that, and if you could measure it, which scientists have done to some extent, you could look at how biodiverse the Earth is. So that's obviously a very big scale, right? Thinking of scales. But you could look on a very small scale as well. You could walk outside wherever you are right now and take a teaspoon of dirt or a teaspoon of water that's sitting in a puddle on the ground, and there will be life in that dirt or water. And if you could measure the variety of that life, then you could come up with biodiversity. So there's biodiversity in all things. I mean, even inside the human body, there's there are multiple types of bacteria that live mostly symbiotically within ourselves. So even you sitting there has your own level of biodiversity within yourself. So the point here is that biodiversity exists on all scales. We tend to think of it in these kind of big, like dramatic, forests with all these big creatures, but it exists on all kinds of scales. And so in your reading, they go over two different types of biodiversity. So genetic biodiversity is the one that is probably less frequently thought of when you think of biodiversity. And now you can think of variation within species. So just like, no two humans are the same. So we have our own genetic biodiversity within our species. And you could look at any other species on Earth, and there's going to be some genetic biodiversity. I mean, there are obviously some things that are clones of each other, but for the most part, there's genetic biodiversity in all species. Now, ecological biodiversity is probably the one that people more commonly think of if they think of biodiversity, and that's the diversity within an ecosystem. So in our initial example, when you look at the biodiversity of the Earth, you probably thought of, whatever, trees and other plants and fish and, lions and tigers and whatever, humans. So that would be all these different species that are existing in a given area. And so that would be considered ecological biodiversity, whereas genetic is just variation within a single species. Okay, so that's a basic explanation of that term. So ecosystem, which I'm sure you've heard this term at some point in your life, but the question is, what exactly is an ecosystem? And you can read this definition. There's some links there. But basically, an ecosystem is, you can think of it as a community of organisms that somehow relate to each other. So they might not be directly dependent on one another, but there is some relationship between the organisms. This is just another definition: interdependent ensembles of organisms. So there is a dynamic relation in space and time. Just means there is some relationship between these organisms. And you can, again, ecosystems are very much scalable. You could look at there is an ecosystem. If you would go out and scoop out that little pile of dirt, there's an ecosystem existing within that pile of dirt. There are organisms that do have a relationship in there. But the Earth is considered by ecologists and biologists as an ecosystem. So again, we're not necessarily directly related to directly impacted by everything on the Earth, but there is some relationship, whether it's through one relationship affects another relationship, which affects another relationship. So somehow we are all connected on planet Earth. So we can be considered an ecosystem. Okay, so in terms of biodiversity, the question is, how much is there? How much variety is there? So scientists spend a lot of time trying to figure out how many organisms are out there. I mean, I'm sure you've heard about species that are discovered and species that become extinct. So the question is how much biodiversity is out there, and this is really ecological biodiversity we're talking about here. So as it turns out, there's the short answer is we don't know actually, but estimates, it depends on who you talk to, but it's going to be in the couple million to the couple of tens of millions out there. So we don't actually know how many there are. We've only identified about 1.7 million, which is a lot when you think about it. But if we think there are up to 30 million unique species out there, and we've only identified 1.7 million, that's really not very much. 5-6%, who knows? So there's probably anywhere from 50 to 90% of the species that exist on the surface of the earth we actually don't even know that they're there, or we at least haven't identified them. So I want you to think about, as we talk about some of the benefits of biodiversity, why this fact is important. The fact being, we have only identified about 1.7 million out of this 3 to 30 million. All right, so I'm going to play a short video. This is E.O. Wilson, his name is Edward Wilson. He is kind of considered the godfather or the grandfather of biodiversity. World famous biologist. He's written a bunch of books and he's done a bunch of research. Anyway, he's a very famous person in this field, and he's going to show you, talk a little bit about some of the interesting aspects of biodiversity. All right, let me maximize this. That should be good enough.
It takes a little effort for me to realize that I and people like me see the world in a different way from others. I see it as a universe of immense diversity. If I bend down here and scrape around, now I want you to notice what appears to be to you just a flat surface, right? But this is not a flat surface to most of life on Earth. This is three-dimensional. We are sort of like the Godzillas of the world, with gigantic organisms, and we walk, crunch across this world like Godzilla over New York. But if you started digging down, you would see that you're passing through numerous layers of different micro-environments.
Beneath the leaves, he imagines a subterranean labyrinth inhabited by micro-monsters. That's an orbatid mite feeding off a fungal thread. And this lumbering giant is a millipede. Tiny mites hitch a ride on its back. The leaf litter teems with invertebrate animals and microorganisms. 99% of life on Earth is smaller than the eye can see. The soil contains millions of bacteria. Many are exotic species still unknown to science.
And that's how so much of the diversity is created in a natural environment like this. It's at your feet, you never see it, but it's here.
Okay, so let's just give you a little bit of an explanation of the interesting aspects of biodiversity, and that a lot of it we don't know is there. I mean, if you're staring, whatever screen you're staring at, whatever room or environment that you're in right now, there's, as Harrison Ford, who actually did narrate that little clip, said, 99% of life you can't even see with your naked eye. So there's biodiversity all around you all the time. A lot of it hasn't been discovered by science. So it's not just the big sort of dramatic organisms that are there. So in terms of biodiversity, so why do we care? I mean, there's a bunch of reasons why we should care. This is not an exhaustive list, but ecosystem services, which we'll go over here in a minute, is a really, really important anthropocentric function. So in terms of its impact on people, biodiversity has a lot of mostly positive benefits. I'll show you an example of some medical discovery. So most of the medicine that humans have, at least a large portion of the medicines that humans use, was derived from natural organisms, usually a plant, or it was somehow, a compound that was taken from a plant and combined with another thing. So aspirin being a really good example. I mean, aspirin was discovered, however many, I don't know, sometime in the early to mid 20th century, and it comes from a moss that grows on a tree. So there are all kinds of medical discoveries that we continue to make that we derive from organisms, and just sort of by definition, the more organisms we have out there, the more possibility for these medical discoveries that we have. So resilience is a really important one. If you remember resilience, we've talked about that a few times, particularly earlier in the semester. So if you want to, press pause and think about what resilience means. But resilience basically means the ability to withstand a shock to the system and sort of bounce back. And so if you take a given area of land, so let's say you take this area that's in this photo right here. Now there's probably a pretty good amount of biodiversity in here. It looks like some kind of a rainforest, maybe a temperate rainforest. So even just in this photo, you can see multiple plant species, and there's certainly a lot of species in the soil and so forth. So if you take this plot of land and imagine you have 1,000 different types of organisms on there. And if some sort of disturbance happens, whether you have an invasive species or some kind of fungus or a disease that comes by and kills a certain type of plant, let's say. So let's say there's a disease that comes by and kills all the ferns. If you have other species, so you have a lot of biodiversity in the area, if there's something that comes in and kills the ferns, you have these other plants that are there that sort of give it a little bit of a resilience. Okay, so there's the more sort of law of averages, the more species you have in an area, the more likely you have at least one or more species that are able to withstand some kind of a shock, whether it's a disease or other type of problem. So if you would take that plot of land and there's a disease that attacks the ferns, you're going to bounce back. Maybe the ferns will probably come back, but overall the land's integrity kind of stays there. And if you compare that to if you just had a field of ferns, for example, just to take an extreme example, and there was no biodiversity, that there was one species, if you have that same disease come in and kill all the ferns, then you lose all your life. And so that's kind of just a somewhat extreme example, but if you just think about the ability of any area, this could be a water, this could be a neighborhood, a forest, a field, a farm, whatever, the more different types of organisms you have in a given area, the more likely they are to be able to withstand some sort of shock to the system. And so that's resilience. That's an important aspect of biodiversity. And just, in general, variety is the variety, especially in nature, can just be a very beautiful thing. And really, I mean, if you think about it, it's interesting and kind of wonderful. So biodiversity is important on a bunch of different sort of scales and from a number of different perspectives. So in your reading, they listed a few of the threats to biodiversity. So I want you to think about some of the threats that they identified. You think of habitat loss, so think of cutting down a rainforest to put in a farm, or cutting down a forest to put in a neighborhood of houses. Overexploitation, so overfishing or cutting down too many trees. Invasive species is a big problem. If you think about, there's all kinds of examples of humans bringing species into some environment, and then that species, because of the native species in the area don't have a resistance built up to it, that it can kind of decimate the population. There's all kinds of examples of this. I mean, there's kind of a famous one of someone that brought rabbits over to Australia, and that was not native to Australia, and the local, there were no predators that could sort of control the rabbit population, so then they just had this, it was overrun with rabbits. There's a story, of snails in Hawaii. Even if you think about, the decimation of Native American populations in the early, when the Europeans came over, one of the big problems for Native Americans was that they hadn't built up resistance to diseases that the Europeans had. So there were a significant portion of Native American population died just from diseases that Europeans could survive. So anything that, if you bring in a species from somewhere else, where the other species are not used to having it around, that can cause big problems. Climate change is the big X factor in this. When you look at climate change, if it's getting warmer, certain species can't survive. You have extreme events that could occur that could compromise biodiversity. Climate change could really just throw everything for a loop. Pollution is a big problem as well, and there's other things. So overall, it's really just human activity. I mean, that is the main threat to biodiversity loss. It's really human activity. So all these are human. And as the reading says, about a third of all species globally are threatened with extinction. That's a big deal. I mean, that's a lot. So how do we prevent this loss? Well, kind of don't do all these things, right? I mean, that's the main way to do it. You can protect the native habitats. You can, you can support land trusts, which they basically buy up land that you can't be developed. You can use native species. You can do things to try to slow climate change. Generally speaking, promoting sustainability is a good idea. Eating food from sustainable farms, and really one of the big things you can do is educate yourself and others. The more you know, the more likely you are to address something. Okay, so let's talk about ecosystem services. There was a short video, actually 2 videos that detail ecosystem services. And so I want you to go ahead and press pause and think about what ecosystem services are. And so they're benefits that people obtain from ecosystems. Nature does a lot of really great things for humans that they don't have to pay for. So it's a really nice service, as the ecosystem provides. So it's probably easiest to go over a few examples. So go ahead and press pause, and if you want to think about a few things that nature does for humans, services they provide that helps humans survive, that humans don't have to pay for. Okay, so here's a couple. So food production, right? So nature provides all kinds of food, whether it's fish in lakes or the sea, natural. I mean, just think about if you've ever seen, wild blackberry bushes growing. That's food. People that hunt for food. There's a lot of native populations that they rely almost entirely on wild foods. Production and maintenance of oxygen. So of course, plants they pull in CO2 and they emit oxygen. They are the main. I mean, they're the main provider of oxygen on Earth. So obviously, without oxygen, we'd be really in big trouble. We don't have to pay for any of that. Filtration of poison. So if you take some nasty, chemical laden water and dump it out in the soil will actually act as a natural filter. But it filters out all kinds of toxins. Climate moderation is a big thing. So again, if you remember back to the climate, the carbon cycle, nature is a really important recycler of carbon dioxide. It provides fresh water, decomposes waste, creates soil, controls pests. I mean, there's all kinds of things. It sounds almost silly to say, but without nature, humans wouldn't survive at all. We wouldn't be here. So there's an awful lot of things that it provides. So what's kind of interesting is if you are getting all these things for free, and this was addressed in the video, it's like you get these things for free. It would be interesting to find out, what if we had to pay for them? How much would it actually cost? And so there's this really famous study that was published in 1997 by this guy Robert Costanza and a few folks, and they did that very thing, and they tallied up a low estimate of the global ecosystem services provision that year was $33 trillion. Okay, this is their low estimate. So this is like if we had to pay for all of these services that they provide. Now, of course, you take all this with a grain of salt, but this is peer-reviewed research, really well-regarded study. So it's 33 trillion a year, 33 trillion per year. So I'll let you take a guess how much the actual world GDP was that year. It turned out it was about $18 trillion. So as a low estimate in this 1997 study, the ecosystem provided almost double what the actual economic output of all humans on the planet. So it's maybe not always best to think of this just in terms of dollars and cents, but if you do, you realize that it is really beneficial. Okay, so the sixth mass extinction. So mass extinction event is when 50 to 90% species of all species die. Okay, so this has happened. Five times in history. So this is the geologic history. The last time it happened was the end of the dinosaurs about 65, 66 million years ago. You know, the whole asteroid hitting in the Yucatan Peninsula, Mexico, all that stuff. So the dinosaurs died out. It was a mass extinction. It wasn't just the dinosaurs. There was all kinds of species. A majority of species on planet Earth went extinct when that happened. And so that was the most recent one. And then there were 4 prior to that, and you know, the hundreds of millions to a billion years ago. So it turns out we're actually right now, the species naturally die out. So we expect species, about 1 out of every million species, to die out or go extinct per year. Okay, so this is called a background extinction rate. About 1 out of every million species per year should go extinct. Currently, it's about 100 to 100,000 times that rate. So there's a sixth. So there's been 5 mass extinctions so far. We are currently actually going through a slow mass extinction. So not that 50 to 90% of the species are dead, but they're on their way. So we're headed toward this trajectory where if we don't change our ways, all the stuff we talked about that humans are doing, that 50 to 90% of species will probably die out. Now this could be 100 years from now, it could be 300 years from now. We don't know, but we do know that we are accelerating the rate of extinction dramatically, to the point that it's becoming a little bit scary. This has actually become a really big topic. There's a recent book called The Sixth Extinction out. There was a movie about biodiversity, mass extinction, that just came out. So this is becoming a really big topic. So this is something maybe to keep your eye out for the 6th mass extinction. Okay, so I just want to go over one example of the benefit of nature in terms of medical and the medical field. So there's something called the Rosy Periwinkle. It's just this native of Madagascar, the big island off of the coast of southeast part of Africa. It's just a nice little flower, no big deal. So it turns out this little flower is the source of 2 cancer-fighting medicines. One of them helped increase the survival rate of childhood leukemia from 10% to 95%. I mean, that's a really huge deal. And then is also used to treat Hodgkin's disease. This is just one small example, and again, there are many, many examples of this all over the world, of plants and sometimes animals providing medical breakthroughs, and there's very active research in this field. And so I kind of want to wrap this all up back to the first slide. Remember when I mentioned that we only know, maybe 10, at most 50% of all species that exist on the Earth. So one of the big problems with biodiversity loss is that it's very, very likely that we are and probably already have destroyed some really valuable species that we're never going to back. Once something is extinct, it's gone. And so one of the really bad things about biodiversity loss, all these things that we're doing to compromise biodiversity, is that we're in a lot of ways shooting ourselves in the foot. As one author wrote, by destroying species, we're cutting off the limb. We're sitting on a tree, and by reducing biodiversity, we're slowly cutting off the limb that we're sitting on. So we're sort of undermining our own ability to survive. So that's something to think about in terms of biodiversity and some of the importance.